What happens when deep-seated prejudice and bloated entitlement collide inside the pressurized cabin of a transatlantic flight? You might expect a heated argument, maybe an apology, and an awkward 7 hours. You wouldn't expect an event that would end a career, shatter a marriage, and create a viral moment of justice heard around the world. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a man yelling at a teenager. It's about the quiet strength that defies bigotry, the unexpected heroes who refuse to stay silent, and the stunning announcement from a captain that brought an entire first-class cabin to a standstill. Stay tuned, because the karma that follows is as swift and turbulent as a jet hitting a storm. Before we dive deeper, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of resilience in the face of disrespect, tap that subscribe button for more stories of justice served. The hum of the Boeing 767's cabin was a symphony of quiet privilege. The scent of warm towels, a hint of expensive perfume, and the soft clink of glasses being prepped for pre-departure champagne filled the air. This was the sanctuary of Flight 735 from London Heathrow to New York's JFK, a world sealed off from the chaos of the main terminal. Into this serene environment stepped 17-year-old Jamal Williams. He was tall and slender, with a posture that spoke of years of disciplined practice. He wore a simple but well-fitted gray blazer over a black t-shirt, dark jeans, and immaculate sneakers. His expression was calm and observant, his eyes taking in the plush, cream-colored leather of his assigned seat, 2A, a window seat in the coveted first row of the first-class cabin. Slung over his shoulder was a backpack, and in his right hand he carefully carried a sleek black carbon fiber case that was unmistakably for a cello. He found his seat, slid the cello case gently into the adjacent private closet as instructed by the welcoming flight attendant, and settled into the spacious pod. He pulled out a worn copy of The Language of Music Theory and Practice, placed it on the polished wood grain tray table, and began to lose himself in its complex patterns. He was polite to a fault, offering a soft thank you, as the flight attendant, a warm-eyed woman named Maria Gonzalez, offered him a choice of orange juice or champagne. He chose the juice. He was in his own world, a bubble of focus and quiet anticipation. Jamal wasn't born into privilege. Growing up in Brixton, South London, with a history professor father and a high school principal mother, he'd been taught the value of education, hard work, and self-respect. His parents had sacrificed much to nurture his extraordinary talent, from second jobs to fund his first cello to countless hours driving him to competitions across the country. His grandfather, once a renowned jazz saxophonist who played with the greats in New Orleans before emigrating to England in the 1960s, had blended musical traditions in ways that profoundly shaped Jamal's approach to classical repertoire. "Music transcends all boundaries," his grandfather would tell him, slipping effortlessly between a Bach fugue and an improvisational jazz riff on his own saxophone. "It cares about the dedication in your heart and the skill in your fingers, not the color of your skin or where you come from." Those words had carried Jamal through countless uncomfortable moments: the raised eyebrows when he walked into prestigious concert halls, the whispers when he was the only black face in youth orchestras, the assumptions that he must be lost when he entered spaces traditionally dominated by wealth and whiteness. He was on his way to New York to compete in the final round of the prestigious Averton International Music Competition, a prize that could launch the career of any young classical musician. Out of thousands of applicants worldwide, only 3 had made it to the finals. Jamal was the youngest. This flight, this first-class seat, wasn't a luxury his family could afford. It was part of the prize package for becoming a finalist, sponsored by the airline itself through its Rising Stars Arts program. For Jamal, the seat wasn't a status symbol. It was a quiet space to prepare his mind for the most important performance of his life. Maria Gonzalez had been flying this route for 7 years. She'd seen the full spectrum of human behavior at 35,000 feet, from the kindest gestures to the most entitled tantrums. Something about the altitude seemed to strip away people's pretenses, revealing their true character in moments of stress or inconvenience. Maria had a particular sensitivity to the subtle discrimination she sometimes witnessed. Her own daughter, Sophia, a promising young violinist, had once been asked if she was lost when she arrived for a prestigious youth orchestra audition. Maria had watched her daughter's face fall, then harden with resolve. That memory made her particularly attentive to Jamal's comfort from the moment he boarded. "Can I get you anything else before we finish boarding?" Maria asked, noting how Jamal's fingers tapped silently on his book, as if playing invisible notes. "No, thank you," he replied with a smile. "I'm perfect." Maria nodded and continued her preparations. The tranquility of this pre-departure ritual would soon be shattered, though neither she nor Jamal could have anticipated how dramatically. Have you ever found yourself in a space where you were unfairly judged based solely on your appearance? What emotions did that experience trigger, and how did you respond? Share your personal story in the comments below. "Can you believe this?" The words sliced through the gentle hum of the first-class cabin. "They're letting kids wander up from economy to take a look now. The standards are just gone." The tranquility was broken by the arrival of William Barrett and his wife Elaine. William, in his mid-50s, initially presented an image of polished professionalism. His handshake was firm but not aggressive as he greeted a fellow passenger he recognized from business circles. His suit was tailored perfectly, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being accommodated in all situations. To a casual observer, William Barrett might have seemed simply like a successful businessman, perhaps demanding but not immediately unlikable. He smiled warmly at Maria as she offered him champagne accepted with a practiced thank you and asked about the flight time with apparent courtesy. But beneath this veneer of civility lay something darker. His smile never quite reached his eyes, and there was a studied quality to his politeness that suggested performance rather than genuine warmth. William Barrett hadn't just entered rooms. He assessed them, measuring each space and person against his internal hierarchy of importance. As Senior Vice President of Acquisitions for Tech Fusion Global, he had spent 2 decades climbing over colleagues and crushing competitors on his way to the executive suite. His success wasn't just about talent. It was about the systematic elimination of obstacles, including people who stood in his way. His wife Elaine trailed a step behind him, a woman whose own personality seemed to have been eroded over years of orbiting her husband's immense ego. Once a talented architect with her own ambitions, she had gradually been reduced to the role of constant apologizer, forever smoothing the ripples her husband's behavior created in social waters. Her designer outfits and impeccable makeup couldn't hide the resignation in her eyes. William Barrett scanned the cabin with a proprietary air, his gaze passing over the other passengers before landing on Jamal. Something shifted in his expression, a momentary tightening around his eyes, an almost imperceptible narrowing of his gaze. It was a look that lasted no more than a second, but it revealed an immediate categorization. This person does not fit my understanding of who belongs here. He nudged his wife toward their seats, 2C and 2D, directly across the aisle from Jamal. "Can you believe this?" William muttered to Elaine, just loud enough for Jamal to hear over the cabin's hum. "They're letting kids from economy wander up here to take a look now. The standards are just gone." Jamal didn't react. He had heard variations of that sentiment his entire life. He had learned long ago that engaging with such casual prejudice was a fool's errand. He kept his eyes on his book, his posture unchanged. The best response, his grandfather had always told him, is to be so undeniable they can't ignore your right to be there. But William Barrett was not a man to be ignored. After stowing his own luggage with a series of practiced movements, he settled into his seat and caught Maria's eye as she passed. "Excuse me," he said, his voice measured and professional. "I think there may have been a mix-up with the seating assignments. The young man across from us seems confused about his seat location." He gestured with a subtle nod toward Jamal, his tone concerned rather than overtly hostile. Maria smiled her professionally polite, unshakable smile. "No mix-up, sir. He's in his assigned seat." "Can I get you a glass of champagne to start?" William's face tightened almost imperceptibly. The easy dismissal of his concern was unexpected. He was accustomed to people taking his suggestions seriously. His assigned seat. I see. He leaned across the aisle, his voice now taking on a patronizing, helpful tone. Son. He set his eyes, finally locking onto Jamal. Son, I know this cabin looks exciting, but your seat is probably in the back. It's easy to get turned around on a big plane like this. Behind him, the curtain parted as Alexander Park entered the first-class cabin. Park, a 45-year-old Korean-American, was the co-founder of Nexus Capital, one of Silicon Valley's most successful venture capital firms. His tailored suit spoke of wealth, but his observant eyes and reserved demeanor suggested a man who preferred to watch and listen before speaking. Alexander Park's journey to becoming a venture capital leader hadn't been smooth. As the son of immigrants who lost their grocery store during the 1992 Los Angeles riots, he had witnessed firsthand how quickly privilege could protect some while leaving others vulnerable. His parents' resilience in rebuilding their business had instilled in him a deep commitment to creating more equitable systems, a value that informed his investment philosophy at Nexus Capital. Park took his seat in 1D directly in front of William. He nodded politely to Maria, requested still water instead of champagne, and opened his Financial Times. But his attention wasn't on the newspaper. Something in the tone of William's voice had caught his ear, and he found himself listening intently to the interaction across the aisle. Jamal slowly lifted his gaze from his book. He looked at William Barrett, his expression unreadable, his voice calm and even. "I'm in the right place," he said. And then, with a quiet finality that should have ended the conversation, he returned his eyes to the page. It didn't. For William Barrett, it was just the beginning. The quiet assurance in Jamal's tone was like a spark on dry tinder. Elaine Barrett shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This wasn't their first flight, and this wasn't the first time William had taken it upon himself to correct a situation no one had asked him to address. She'd seen that look in his eye before, that mixture of certainty and indignation that inevitably led to scenes she would later have to smooth over. "William," she said softly, touching his arm, "let the attendant handle it. It's their job." He shook her off without looking at her. "I've been flying first class longer than this kid's been alive. I know when something's not right." Alexander Park lowered his newspaper slightly, watching the interaction over the top of his reading glasses. In his years of evaluating companies and their leadership, he'd developed a keen eye for character. What he was witnessing was telling, not just about the man doing the talking, but about the teenager responding with such composure. Have you ever observed someone's true character gradually reveal itself in a public setting? What subtle cues gave away their real nature beneath the polite facade? Share your observations in the comments below. Look, kid, I'm just trying to help you out before you get into real trouble. The quiet assurance in Jamal's tone was like a spark that ignited something in William Barrett. In his world, people deferred to him. Junior employees laughed at his bad jokes. Waiters promptly refilled his water. And teenagers, especially black teenagers, did not speak to him with such self-possession. "The right place." William scoffed, his voice rising slightly. The veneer of polite concern was beginning to crack, revealing the entitlement beneath. His wife Elaine placed a delicate manicured hand on his arm. "William, please," she whispered, her face already tinged with the familiar embarrassment she felt when he began one of his escalations. He shook her hand off without a glance. "Look, kid, I'm just trying to help you out before you get into real trouble." William continued leaning further into the aisle. Several other passengers in the nearby pods were beginning to notice their quiet conversations faltering. Alexander Park lowered his Financial Times and watched over the top of his glasses. The woman in 3A, an elegantly dressed grandmother named Beatrice Harlow, paused her knitting. The businessman in 3C, Rafael Suarez, a marketing executive from Miami, glanced up from his laptop, frowning slightly. The flight attendants are going to come through and check boarding passes, and it's going to be very embarrassing for you when they escort you back to economy. Why don't you just head back there now? Jamal's fingers paused on the page of his book. Inside his mind sought refuge in music. In moments of stress, he had trained himself to hear specific pieces, a technique his mentor, Dr. Isaiah Thompson, had taught him for maintaining equilibrium under pressure. Now the rich tones of Bach's Cello Suite No. 3 flowed through his consciousness, each note creating a buffer between himself and Barrett's words. The prelude's cascading arpeggios mirrored his quickened heartbeat, but the mathematical precision of the composition helped center him. Each measured breath he took corresponded to the rhythm of the music, an internal metronome that kept him steady. When the world tries to throw you off balance, Dr. Thompson would say in his deep, reassuring voice, find your own center and hold to it. Your music is your anchor. Maria Gonzalez, who had been discreetly observing, stepped forward again. Her training was all about de-escalation, about maintaining the serene atmosphere her first-class passengers paid a premium for. "Sir," she said, addressing William directly, her voice still pleasant but now edged with firmness. "I can assure you again this passenger's boarding pass has been checked, and he is in the correct seat. Our pre-departure service will be starting shortly." William turned his full attention to her, the pleasant mask now completely dropped as his face flushed. "And I'm telling you, you're wrong. Did you scan it yourself? Look at him. Does he look like he belongs here? Maybe he found the ticket. Maybe it's a fake. Are you even checking for that anymore?" The accusation hung in the air, ugly and sharp. It was no longer about a simple seating mistake. It was a direct challenge to Jamal's presence, his legitimacy. Jamal slowly closed his book, the soft thud of the cover echoing in the now tense silence. He placed his hands on his knees, his posture still relaxed, but his eyes were now fixed on William. "Sir," Jamal said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I don't know who you are or why you're so concerned with my travel arrangements, but I paid for this seat, or rather, it was paid for on my behalf. My boarding pass is in my pocket, and the name on it is Jamal Williams. It matches my passport. Is there anything else I can help you with?" The articulate formal response seemed to enrage William even more. He saw it not as a plea for civility, but as a challenge to his authority. "Paid for on your behalf." William barked out a short laugh. "Oh, I get it, of course. Let me guess. Daddy's a basketball player, a rapper splashing out money he didn't earn on his kid." The words were a physical blow. Every stereotype, every lazy racist assumption was now laid bare. Jamal felt a hot flush of anger rise in his chest. But he forced it down, picturing his mentor, Dr. Isaiah Thompson, a man who preached that self-control under pressure was as important as any musical technique. "Don't let them pull you into their storm," Isaiah would say. "Stay in your calm center. It's where your power lives." Elaine Barrett was now whispering frantically to her husband. "William, for God's sake, stop it. You're making a scene." "I'm making a scene," he retorted now, standing up fully in the aisle, his bulk casting a shadow over Jamal. "I'm a million-mile flyer with this airline. I practically keep their lights on with what I spend here. I have a right to ensure the integrity of this cabin. I pay thousands for this ticket so I don't have to deal with this." He waved a dismissive hand in Jamal's direction. Alexander Park had now put his newspaper down entirely. He was a tech investor, a man who built his career on reading people and situations. He saw a classic case of an entitled bully high on his own perceived importance and a young man displaying a level of composure that was frankly astonishing. He discreetly positioned his phone on his lap, its screen facing the aisle, and tapped the record button. He didn't do this to create viral content. He did it because his parents, who had rebuilt their destroyed grocery store after the riots, had taught him that documentation was sometimes the only defense against injustice. Too many times in his own life he had wished someone had recorded the subtle and not-so-subtle biases he'd faced in boardrooms and business-class lounges. Rafael Suarez, watching from 3C, felt a knot in his stomach. As a Hispanic executive who had fought his way into boardrooms that hadn't always welcomed him, he recognized the familiar patterns of exclusion playing out. He'd been silent too many times in his career when he should have spoken up. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to leading meetings. "The young man has every right to be there. Leave him alone." William's head swiveled toward Rafael, his eyes narrowing. "Mind your own business. This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it concerns all of us," Beatrice Harlow said, her British accent crisp and refined. "You're disturbing the peace we've all paid for." The cabin was dividing. A few passengers nodded in agreement with Beatrice and Rafael. Others looked down or away, unwilling to get involved. A woman in her 30s glanced between William and Jamal with concerned eyes, clearly uncomfortable but uncertain whether to speak. Maria, seeing the situation escalating, spoke into the small phone connected to the cabin crew station. "Supervisor to first class, please. Potential passenger conflict." William saw this as another victory. In his mind, reinforcements were being summoned to validate his worldview. "Finally," he said, sitting back down with a satisfied grunt. "Someone with actual authority." Across the aisle, Jamal remained perfectly still. His breathing measured his expression neutral, but inside the music had stopped. Now he heard only his grandfather's voice. "Sometimes, boy, the hardest thing isn't playing the notes. It's finding your strength when the world wants to make you feel weak." In the deafening silence that followed, Jamal closed his eyes briefly. The cabin noise faded away. For 5 seconds, 5 precious seconds, he allowed himself this moment of inner stillness, drawing from the well of resilience his family had filled over generations. When he opened his eyes again, they held a quiet determination that even William Barrett could not shake. When have you faced a situation where you had to maintain your composure despite feeling attacked or belittled? What internal resources helped you remain steady in that moment? I'd love to hear your personal strategies in the comments. Get your supervisor, or better yet, get the captain. I want this kid off the plane. Maria, the flight attendant, knew the situation was now beyond her control. Her professional smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of serious concern. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat and lower your voice. You are disturbing the other passengers and creating a hostile environment." "Hostile? I'll show you hostile!" William bellowed, jabbing a finger first at Maria, then at Jamal. "Get your supervisor, or better yet, get the captain. I want this kid off the plane. He's probably carrying something in that ridiculous case of his. I want him and his bag searched and removed now." The threat was clear. The accusation, baseless and vile, had escalated from prejudice to a direct allegation of wrongdoing and potential danger. The entire cabin was now silent, all eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Passengers in the business class cabin just behind the curtain were beginning to crane their necks, sensing the disturbance. A woman in a crisp pantsuit, Vanessa Rodriguez, a culture reporter for the New York Times, had already taken out her notebook, journalist's instincts kicking in. Jamal finally stood up. He was taller than William had given him credit for, and he met the older man's furious gaze without flinching. "You've said enough," Jamal said, his voice low and controlled. It wasn't anger that fueled his words. It was resolve, the kind that comes from generations of having to prove your worth in spaces designed to exclude you. This wasn't his first encounter with prejudice. When he was 12, a competition judge had accused him of having a professional play his audition recording. At 14, a concert hall security guard had stopped him at the performer's entrance, insisting he use the public doors despite his clearly visible credential lanyard. Last year at a master class in Vienna, a renowned cellist had expressed surprise that someone from your background could so masterfully interpret Bach. Each time, Jamal had responded not with outrage, but with undeniable skill. Each note he played was an argument for his belonging, each performance a rebuttal to the assumptions made about him. His cello wasn't just an instrument, it was his voice in a world that too often tried to silence him. Maria, seeing the potential for a physical confrontation, immediately spoke into the small phone connected to the cockpit. "Purser to flight deck. We have a code orange situation in the first-class cabin. A passenger is verbally abusive and refusing to comply with crew instructions, requesting captain's presence at seat 2D. The request had been made. The point of no return had been crossed. The quiet hum of the 707's cabin now felt like the silence before a lightning strike. The words "Code Orange" sent a ripple of alarm through the crew and the few passengers who understood airline terminology. It signified a serious security issue involving an unruly passenger. For William Barrett, however, hearing the flight attendant call for the captain was a victory. In his mind, the highest authority was now being summoned to validate his worldview and remove the anomaly that was Jamal Williams. "Finally," Williams sneered, sinking back into his seat with a triumphant smirk. "Someone with some actual authority. You'll see. They'll take one look at this situation and know who's right." He winked at his wife, but Elaine refused to meet his gaze. She had sunk into her seat, her face pale, wishing she could disappear into the expensive leather upholstery. 23 years of marriage had taught her the familiar rhythms of William's outbursts, but something about this felt different. A line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Across the aisle, Jamal remained standing, hands relaxed at his sides, his breathing controlled. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't afraid. He was observing. Each interaction with William Barrett had given him more information, more insight into the kind of man he was dealing with. And now he understood completely this wasn't about a seat or a ticket, or even about him. This was about a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in exclusivity and keeping certain spaces and certain people separate from himself. Alexander Park continued filming discreetly, his phone capturing every word, every gesture. As a venture capitalist, he had developed an eye for red flags in company leadership. What he was witnessing wasn't just a personal moral failure. It was the kind of character flaw that could sink an entire organization if left unchecked. Executives who behaved like this in public often created toxic environments behind closed doors. The few minutes it took for the captain to arrive felt like an eternity. The cabin was a tableau of discomfort. Most passengers stared resolutely out their windows or at the blank screens in front of them, desperate not to be involved. A few, however, watched openly, their faces a mixture of disgust and morbid curiosity. Rafael Suarez, the marketing executive who had spoken up earlier, was on his phone typing rapidly. He wasn't posting about the incident, not yet, but he was making notes. In his business understanding, human behavior was currency, and what he was witnessing was a masterclass in how not to handle conflict. Beatrice Harlow, the elderly woman with the knitting needles, had put her work aside and was watching with sharp, clear eyes. She had lived through decades of social change, had seen the civil rights movement unfold, had witnessed the slow, painful progress toward equality. And here, in what should have been the twilight of her life, she was watching the same ugly patterns play out in a luxury cabin at 35,000 feet. "History doesn't move in a straight line, does it?" she said quietly to no one in particular. "It spirals. We keep coming back to the same points, fighting the same battles." Maria stood at the ready, positioned slightly between William and Jamal, though she was careful not to make it obvious that she was creating a buffer. Her training had prepared her for difficult passengers, but the racial undertones of this confrontation went beyond the standard protocols. She caught Jamal's eye for a moment, and something passed between them, an unspoken recognition. Maria's own daughter Sophia had faced similar moments of exclusion in her young musical career. As a Hispanic girl in a predominantly white youth orchestra, Sophia had been asked more than once if she was really sure she was in the right rehearsal room. Maria had coached her daughter through those moments, teaching her that her talent spoke louder than any prejudice. Now seeing Jamal stand his ground with such composure, she felt a surge of protective admiration. The cockpit door opened with a quiet hiss, and out stepped not the grizzled, middle-aged man William had clearly been expecting, but a woman in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent blue eyes and blonde hair pulled back in a severe professional bun. Her uniform was immaculate, the 4 stripes on her epaulets gleaming under the cabin lights. This was Captain Gabriela Montero, a former Air Force pilot with over 15,000 flight hours and a legendary no-nonsense reputation among her crews. She didn't stride into the cabin. She owned it. Her presence instantly shifted the atmosphere from a public squabble to a serious command situation. She walked directly to Maria, who gave her a quick, hushed summary of the events, pointing to William and then to Jamal. Captain Montero listened intently, her expression unreadable. She nodded once, then turned her steely gaze on William Barrett. "Sir, I'm Captain Montero," she said, her voice calm and carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "I understand you have a concern." The momentum was about to shift in ways William Barrett couldn't possibly anticipate. The power he thought he wielded was about to be eclipsed by something far greater, actual authority, backed by both moral and institutional power. If you witnessed someone being unfairly targeted because of their appearance, what specific actions would you take to intervene? Would you speak up directly, record the incident, or find another way to show support? Share your personal approach to being an effective ally in the comments. On my aircraft, we judge people by their actions, not their appearance. Buoyed by what he perceived as a receptive ear, William launched into his story, painting himself as the vigilant, concerned passenger. "Thank you, Captain," he began, practically beaming. "Yes, this young man," he said, gesturing at Jamal, "is refusing to admit he's in the wrong seat. He's clearly from economy, and he's become aggressive when confronted. Frankly, I don't feel safe with him or his luggage on this aircraft. For all we know, he's a security risk." Captain Montero's eyes flickered to Jamal for a moment, taking in his calm demeanor, and then back to the florid, agitated face of William Barrett. She had seen this scenario play out dozens of times in her career in various forms. It was almost always rooted in the same ugly prejudice. "So your concern is twofold," she stated, her tone clinical. "First, you believe he is in the wrong seat. Second, you are suggesting he is a security risk based on—" "What exactly?" "Based on common sense," William sputtered, taken aback by the question. "Look at him. He doesn't belong here. He's being evasive. He's got a huge, strange case with him. I'm a premier executive flyer with your airline, Captain. My safety and my wife's safety should be your primary concern." Captain Montero gave a slow, deliberate nod. She then turned to Jamal. "Young man, may I see your boarding pass and your passport, please?" Jamal wordlessly reached into his jacket, produced the documents, and handed them to her. The captain examined them carefully. "Jamal Williams, seat 2A passport matches," she said, her voice clear and audible to everyone in the surrounding seats. She handed them back to Jamal with a respectful nod. "Thank you, Mr. Williams." She then turned her full attention back to William, her expression now hard as granite. "Mr. Barrett," she said, the honorific now sounding like an indictment. "Mr. Williams is in his correct assigned seat, which he is fully entitled to occupy. Your first concern is therefore invalid. As for your second concern, that he is a security risk, you have provided no evidence for this whatsoever, aside from your own personal feelings. Making a baseless security accusation against a fellow passenger is a serious offense on a commercial aircraft. A very serious offense." William's smug confidence began to visibly deflate, replaced by a flicker of panic. He had overplayed his hand. "Now, hold on," he stammered. "I was just being cautious." "You were being disruptive and discriminatory." Captain Montero cut him off, her voice dropping to a low, resolute tone. "You have verbally harassed a minor, ignored the instructions of my flight crew, and created a disturbance that has delayed our departure preparation. "This is my aircraft, Mr. Barrett. My rules, and you have broken several of them." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent cabin. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. William Barrett, the self-proclaimed king of the cabin, was now just a chastened passenger being dressed down in front of his peers. Captain Montero wasn't just addressing William. She was sending a message to everyone in the cabin, to everyone in uniform, and to Jamal himself on her aircraft. Respect was non-negotiable. Gabriela Montero hadn't become a captain by accident or by following the path of least resistance. As one of the few female Hispanic pilots in a field still dominated by white men, she had faced her share of skepticism, condescension, and outright hostility. Early in her career, a male colleague had told her that Latinas make better flight attendants than pilots. Another had suggested she got her Air Force position through quotas rather than skill. She had responded by becoming one of the most decorated pilots in her squadron, by logging more hours than required, by studying technical manuals during layovers when others were at the hotel bar. Mastery was her armor competence, her weapon. She recognized in Jamal a kindred spirit, someone forced to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. She saw in his composed silence the same strategy she had employed countless times: let your performance speak for you. In the momentary silence that followed her rebuke, Captain Montero looked out the window. The London afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, illuminating the massive wings of the aircraft she commanded. For a brief instant, she allowed herself to remember her brother Carlos and his battle with leukemia, how the experimental treatment funded by the Averton Foundation had given him a second chance at life. The universe had a strange way of connecting these moments, she thought, before turning her attention back to the situation at hand. "Now," the captain continued, "we have two options. Option 1, you will apologize to Mr. Williams and to my flight attendant, sit down, and I will not hear another word from you for the entire 7-hour flight to New York. If I do, we will divert to the nearest airport, where you will be met by law enforcement. Option 2, I deplane you right now here in London, and you can find your own way to New York. Your choice." The ultimatum was absolute. William's face cycled through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, rage, humiliation, and finally a grudging, resentful submission. He was trapped. Being arrested was a non-starter, and being kicked off the flight would be a professional and personal nightmare. He mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Fine. I'm sorry." It was a pathetic, barely audible apology directed at no one in particular. "I don't think they heard you," Captain Montero said, her voice unwavering. William's head snapped up, his eyes burning with impotent fury. He looked at Jamal, then at Maria, and forced the words out through clenched teeth. "I'm sorry." "Good," the captain said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Now sit down." William Barrett collapsed back into his seat, his face a mask of thunderous humiliation. The immediate crisis was over. But Captain Gabriela Montero was not finished. She walked to the front of the cabin, picked up the intercom phone, and pressed the button to address the entire aircraft. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking." The whole plane was about to hear the real story. The soft chime that preceded a cockpit announcement echoed through the aircraft, from the privileged suites of first class to the tightly packed rows in the rear of economy. For most passengers, it was an expected part of the pre-flight routine, a welcome, a flight time update, a mention of expected turbulence. But for the passengers in the first-class cabin who had just witnessed the tense drama, the chime carried a different weight. They knew this wasn't going to be a standard announcement. Every eye was on Captain Montero as she stood at the bulkhead, her expression firm and resolute. William Barrett, still simmering with rage in seat 2D, looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Alexander Park's finger hovered over the stop button on his phone's recording app, but something told him to let it continue. Whatever was about to happen, he sensed it would be significant. In row 3, Rafael Suarez and Beatrice Harlow exchanged a glance. Whatever came next would set the tone for the entire flight. Jamal Williams sat perfectly still, his face a study in dignified restraint. But inside his heart was racing. For the first time since the confrontation began, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened, and what was about to happen. When have you witnessed someone in a position of authority use their power to protect someone vulnerable, rather than side with the more privileged party? What impact did that intervention have? Share your experience of seeing leadership done right in the comments. On this aircraft, every passenger who has earned their seat will be treated with integrity and respect. This is not a suggestion, it is a requirement. The soft chime that preceded a cockpit announcement echoed through the aircraft from the privileged suites of first class to the tightly packed rows in the rear of economy. For most passengers, it was an expected part of the pre-flight routine, a flight time update, a mention of expected turbulence. But for the passengers in the first-class cabin who had just witnessed the tense drama, the chime carried a different weight. They knew this wasn't going to be a standard announcement. Every eye was on Captain Montero, as she stood at the bulkhead, her expression firm and resolute. William Barrett, still simmering with rage in seat 2D, looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your Captain Gabriela Montero." Her voice began calm and professional, yet imbued with a certain gravity that commanded attention. "I'd like to apologize for the slight delay in our departure this morning. We had a brief customer service issue here in the forward cabin, which has now been resolved." She paused. It was a standard corporate-approved way of glossing over an incident, but she wasn't finished. "Usually we like to maintain the privacy of all our passengers," she continued, her voice shifting subtly, taking on a more personal, more deliberate tone. "However, today I feel it's necessary to make an exception. I believe that respect and common decency are not optional extras, but standard operating procedure both for my crew and for the people we serve. And when one of our guests is treated with profound disrespect, I believe it is our duty to respond with profound respect." A murmur went through the cabin. This was highly unusual. Captain Montero's eyes briefly met Jamal's. She saw not arrogance, but a quiet, weary poise that seemed far too old for his 17 years. "We have a very special guest flying with us today in seat 2A, she announced, her voice resonating with genuine admiration. "His name is Jamal Williams. He is not just a passenger. He is a celebrated musician and a brilliant young scholar." William Barrett's head, which had been bowed in shame, slowly lifted, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Mr. Williams," the captain's voice continued, "is a cello prodigy who at just 17 years old has been recognized as one of the most promising classical musicians of his generation. He is flying to New York today because he is one of only 3 people from around the globe to be selected as a finalist for the Averton International Music Competition, one of the highest honors a young instrumentalist can achieve." The information landed with the force of a physical blow. The quiet, unassuming teenager William had tried to bully and belittle was in fact an elite talent, a young man of immense discipline and achievement. The other passengers were now looking at Jamal with a newfound sense of awe and admiration. Alexander Park allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. His camera was still recording, but Captain Montero still hadn't delivered her final devastating payload. "Furthermore," she went on, her voice now ringing with authority, "Mr. Williams is not here on his family's dime, as one passenger loudly assumed. He is flying as a distinguished guest of this airline. He is the inaugural recipient of our Rising Stars sponsorship program, an initiative we created to support and champion extraordinary young people in the arts and sciences. We are not just flying him to New York. We are honored to have him represent the values of excellence and dedication that our airline strives for." The silence in the cabin was now absolute. It was a thick, heavy silence, filled with the unspoken weight of collective shame on William Barrett's behalf. He had not just insulted a passenger. He had insulted a celebrated guest of the very airline he claimed to be a loyal patron of. He had attacked the company's own chosen representative of excellence. Captain Montero let that sink in for a moment before delivering the final personal twist that would utterly silence the plane. "On a personal note," she said, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its power, "the Averton Foundation, which hosts this competition, does more than just support the arts. Their philanthropic grants also fund critical medical research. 15 years ago, a grant from the Averton Foundation funded the experimental treatment that saved my younger brother's life from a rare form of leukemia. So, to us and to me, an invited guest of the Averton Foundation is the most important person on this aircraft today." She placed the phone back in its cradle with a definitive click. The announcement was over. The silence that followed was unlike any other. It wasn't just quiet. It was stunned. Every passenger in the first-class cabin was now looking at Jamal Williams with something approaching reverence. Then they looked at William Barrett with undisguised contempt. He had shrunk in his seat, his face ashen. His world, built on a fragile foundation of bluster and perceived status, had been publicly and systematically dismantled in less than 2 minutes by a pilot who wielded her words with the precision of a surgeon. Maria Gonzalez walked over to Jamal's seat. She leaned down and whispered, "Mr. Williams, on behalf of the entire crew, I am so deeply sorry for what you just experienced. If there is anything at all we can do for you, please don't hesitate to ask." Jamal looked up at her, and for the first time since the ordeal began, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'm okay." And he was. This wasn't his first encounter with prejudice, and it wouldn't be his last. But there was something uniquely satisfying about this particular resolution. The justice had been swift and absolute. The truth had been spoken aloud, not whispered, and for once the person wielding the prejudice had been the one left speechless. As the plane finally began its push back from the gate, the social order of the first-class cabin had been irrevocably rewritten. The man in the expensive suit was now a pariah ignored by the crew and ostracized by his fellow passengers. And the quiet black teenager with the cello was the cabin's undisputed guest of honor. Jamal gazed out the window as the massive aircraft turned toward the runway. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the experience, not just the confrontation with William, but the unexpected alliance with Captain Montero Maria and the other passengers who had spoken up. He watched the London skyline slowly recede as they gained altitude, thinking of his grandfather's jazz clubs and the fusion of musical traditions that had shaped his approach to classical repertoire. The pressure of the upcoming competition remained, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This performance would not just be about winning a prize. It would be about claiming his rightful place on that storied stage. The flight to New York would be long and quiet, but the fallout from William Barrett's actions was just beginning to gather storm clouds on the horizon. Have you ever witnessed someone receive instant consequences for their prejudiced behavior? What was the turning point that shifted the power dynamic? Share your story of seeing justice served in real time in the comments section below. I have never been more mortified in my entire life. As the plane continued eastward across the Atlantic, the aftermath of Captain Montero's announcement settled over the cabin like a weighted blanket, suffocating for one passenger, comforting for another. The 7-hour flight across the Atlantic was the most excruciatingly silent journey of William Barrett's life. He felt the burning stares of the other passengers every time he shifted in his seat. The flight attendants served him with a detached, icy professionalism that was far more chilling than outright hostility. They performed their duties, but they refused to engage with him. He was a non-person. His wife Elaine had put on noise-canceling headphones the moment the seatbelt sign went off and had not spoken a single word to him. The chasm between their seats felt as wide as the ocean they were crossing. William, stewing in a toxic cocktail of humiliation and self-pity, refused to accept blame. In his mind, he was the victim. The captain was overreaching her authority. The flight attendant was incompetent, and the kid was an arrogant punk who had intentionally embarrassed him. He spent the flight mentally drafting a scathing letter to the airline's CEO, a man he'd met once at a charity golf tournament. He would have their jobs. He would make them pay. Meanwhile, just 3 rows ahead, Jamal Williams had settled back into the rhythm of his music. His fingers moved silently on the armrest, practicing the fingering for the Bach suite he would perform at Carnegie Hall. The noise-canceling headphones Maria had brought him played a recording of the legendary cellist Yo-Yo Ma, whose interpretation of Bach had been one of Jamal's earliest inspirations. For Jamal, the confrontation had been unpleasant but ultimately clarifying. He had faced prejudice before, would face it again, but he had also been reminded that for every William Barrett in the world, there were people like Captain Montero Alexander Park, Rafael Suarez, and Beatrice Harlow. People willing to stand up, speak out, bear witness. His father had often told him, "Excellence is your passport, but self-respect is your compass." Today both had served him well. As the plane followed its path over the Atlantic, these 2 lives, now irrevocably connected, couldn't have been moving in more opposite directions. Alexander Park was using the plane's expensive Wi-Fi to do some research. The name William Barrett had registered with him, not because he knew the man personally, but because he recognized the company Tech Fusion Global. The tech world was a surprisingly small ecosystem, and Park's venture capital firm, Nexus Capital, was always looking for promising investments in the data analytics space. A quick search confirmed his suspicion. William Barrett, Senior VP of Acquisitions at Tech Fusion Global, was prominently featured on the company's website. His bio touted his strategic vision and relationship-building skills. Park almost laughed out loud at the irony. What Barrett didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Nexus Capital was in the final stages of due diligence for a significant investment in Tech Fusion. The term sheet for a $60 million Series C funding round was set to be signed in just 4 days. As a lead partner at Nexus, Park had been directly involved in the negotiations, though he had yet to meet Barrett personally. Now he was seeing a side of Tech Fusion's leadership that raised serious red flags. The company culture that Tech Fusion's CEO, Jonathan Rivera, had described in their meetings, inclusive, forward-thinking, respectful, seemed at odds with the behavior Park had just witnessed from a senior executive. For Alexander Park, this wasn't just a business decision. It was deeply personal. His journey to becoming a tech investor had been shaped by watching his immigrant parents struggle to rebuild their grocery store after it was destroyed during the 1992 Los Angeles riots. They had taught him that true success came not just from what you achieved, but how you achieved it with integrity, perseverance, and respect for others' humanity. These weren't just platitudes to Park. They were foundational values that guided Nexus Capital's investment philosophy. Using the plane's Wi-Fi, Park drafted a carefully worded email to his partners at Nexus. The subject line read, "Urgent Tech Fusion due diligence concern. I've just witnessed something that raises significant concerns about Tech Fusion's corporate culture and executive conduct," he wrote. William Barrett, their SVP of Acquisitions, demonstrated behavior that was not only openly discriminatory but potentially litigious. He attached the video file he had recorded along with a factual account of what had transpired. "This is not simply a case of one executive having a bad day," Park continued. "This kind of behavior reflects deeper cultural issues that pose serious risks, reputational, legal, and operational. I recommend we immediately pause the Series C process, pending a thorough review of Tech Fusion's leadership and culture. We cannot in good conscience attach our firm's name and capital to a company where a senior executive behaves this way in public. What happens behind closed doors?" He hit send, and the email shot from the plane across a satellite and into the inboxes of some of the most powerful investors in Silicon Valley. While William Barrett gripped his scotch with white knuckles staring blankly at the in-flight movie screen, and Alexander Park was setting in motion a financial reckoning Vanessa Rodriguez, the New York Times culture reporter seated in business class, had taken out her laptop. The story forming in her mind wasn't just about a confrontation. It was about classical music's accessibility problem, about the barriers young musicians of color still faced, and about how these moments of exclusion rippled through artistic communities. By the time the plane touched down at JFK, she had outlined an article that went beyond a simple in-flight confrontation. It touched on themes of bias in elite spaces, the quiet determination of artistic pursuit, and the surprisingly progressive stance of an airline in a moment of racial tension. Her working title, Dissonance at 35,000 Feet, When Classical Music, Race, and Privilege Collide. As the flight began its descent into JFK, Maria Gonzalez made her way to Jamal's seat. "Mr. Williams," she said quietly, "Captain Montero would like a word with you before you disembark, if that's all right." Jamal nodded. "Of course." Behind him, Beatrice Harlow leaned forward and patted his shoulder gently. "Young man," she said, her British accent crisp but warm, "I've seen many performances in my 78 years, but your composure today was one of the finest. Carnegie Hall will be a breeze after this." Jamal smiled genuinely. "Thank you, ma'am." As the plane taxied to the gate, William Barrett was already on his phone the moment the airplane mode sign went off. He had 3 missed calls from his office and a text from his assistant. "Call ASAP. Jonathan needs to speak with you urgently." A cold knot formed in his stomach. Something was wrong. Very wrong. What's the most satisfying example of natural consequences you've ever witnessed for someone's inappropriate behavior? How did that moment change the dynamics of the situation? I'm curious to hear your real-life stories of accountability in action. What other vulnerabilities exist within their culture? I cannot in good conscience attach our firm's name to a company where this kind of behavior is present at the senior VP level. While William Barrett was sending angry texts to his assistant, Alexander Park was completing his final move. He had just hung up from a conference call with his partners at Nexus Capital, who had watched the video of William's behavior with a mixture of shock and professional concern. "Frankly, Alex, this is disturbing on multiple levels," Sophia Weiss, Nexus's managing partner, had said. "The racial undertones are obvious, but what concerns me equally is the lack of judgment. This is a senior executive who's supposed to be leading acquisitions, building relationships, representing the company to potential partners and targets. And he can't even handle a basic human interaction without creating a PR nightmare." "Exactly," Park had replied, gazing out the airplane window as New York's skyline came into view. "What we're seeing here isn't just a character flaw, it's a vulnerability. And it makes me question everything we've been told about Tech Fusion's culture and leadership." The decision had been unanimous. Nexus would put an immediate hold on the $60 million Series C funding pending a full review of Tech Fusion's executive team and corporate culture. The timing couldn't have been worse for Tech Fusion. They were counting on this capital infusion to fuel their aggressive expansion plans. But for Alexander Park, this wasn't just a business decision. It was personal. Growing up in Los Angeles in the 1980s and 90s, Park had watched his parents build their grocery store through relentless work and unwavering integrity. Then, during the 1992 riots, he had witnessed it all burn to the ground. He remembered his father standing in front of the smoldering ruins, not with anger or despair, but with quiet resolve. "We rebuild," he had said simply, "but this time stronger." And they had not just the physical store, but stronger relationships with the community, creating a business that served as a neighborhood anchor during turbulent times. His parents' response to that devastation had taught Park that true resilience wasn't about protecting what you had, but about using setbacks to create something better than before. When he'd entered the venture capital world after his MBA, he had vowed that the companies he funded would reflect those values. He had built Nexus into a firm known not just for its financial returns, but for its emphasis on ethical leadership and inclusive cultures. Their investment thesis explicitly recognized that companies with diverse leadership and respectful cultures outperformed their peers over time. What he had witnessed on the plane was the antithesis of those values, a man using his power and privilege to belittle someone he perceived as lesser based solely on race and age. As the seatbelt sign pinged off and passengers began the usual scramble to retrieve their belongings, Park made one final call. This one was directly to Jonathan Rivera, CEO of Tech Fusion Global. "Jonathan Alexander Park from Nexus. We need to talk, and it can't wait." Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Jamal Williams was having a very different kind of conversation. As the last passengers filed past, Captain Gabriela Montero had emerged from the cockpit to speak with him personally. "Mr. Williams," she said, extending her hand, "I wanted to properly apologize for what happened earlier. It's unacceptable that you had to experience that on our aircraft." Jamal shook her hand, noticing the firm grip, the direct eye contact. "Thank you, Captain, but you have nothing to apologize for. You handled it perfectly." Captain Montero smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. "That's kind of you to say, but I also wanted to give you this." She handed him a business card with her personal email written on the back. "My brother is the concertmaster for the Philadelphia Orchestra. If there's ever anything he or I can do for you, introductions, recommendations, anything at all, please don't hesitate to reach out." Jamal accepted the card, touched by the gesture. "I appreciate that more than I can say." "One more thing," she added. "When is your competition performance?" "This Friday at Carnegie Hall, 7 p.m. Captain Montero nodded. "I have a layover in New York that night. If you can spare a ticket, I'd be honored to attend." For the first time all day, Jamal felt a lump in his throat. "I'll have one waiting at will call." As they parted ways, Beatrice Harlow approached her knitting needles, now tucked away in a vintage leather case. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of age, "I have lived long enough to see history repeat itself in both tragic and beautiful ways. Today was both. The tragedy of that man's prejudice and the beauty of your composure in response. Never lose that inner strength." "Thank you, ma'am," Jamal said, helping her retrieve her small carry-on from the overhead bin. "I was at the March on Washington in 1963, you know," she continued. "I heard Dr. King speak of a dream where people would be judged by the content of their character. Today, you showed more character in silence than that man showed in all his bluster." She patted his hand. "I'm staying in New York with my daughter. Here's my number. I'd like to come to your performance as well, if that's possible." Jamal promised to arrange it, and they exchanged contact information. As the last passengers disembarked, William Barrett pushed his way through, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His wife, Elaine, followed a few steps behind her, face drawn and tired. As she passed Jamal, she paused briefly. "I'm sorry," she whispered so quietly he almost didn't catch it. Then she hurried after her husband. The contrast between these parallel journeys couldn't have been starker. William Barrett's world was imploding with every step he took away from the aircraft, while Jamal Williams found himself surrounded by unexpected allies and opportunities. Outside in the terminal, the consequences of Williams' actions were already spiraling beyond his control. Alexander Park's call to Jonathan Rivera had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape Tech Fusion's future. The New York Times culture reporter Vanessa Rodriguez was already drafting her article, having collected statements from multiple witnesses. And in the digital ether, the video recording of the incident was being uploaded to Nexus Capital's secure server, preserved as evidence for the board's emergency meeting the following morning. William Barrett thought he was simply heading into Manhattan for an ordinary business trip. In reality, he was walking into the eye of a perfect storm of his own creation. Have you ever witnessed someone's poor judgment in a public setting lead to unexpected professional consequences? What was the moment when you realized their actions would have repercussions beyond that immediate situation? I'd love to hear your stories about watching the dominoes fall after someone's mask slipped in public. Don't John me, Bob. Where are you good? Don't bother coming into the office tomorrow or ever again. By the time William Barrett checked into his Midtown Manhattan hotel, his world had already begun to unravel, though he didn't yet grasp the full magnitude of the disaster heading his way. His wife Elaine had remained icily silent throughout the taxi ride from JFK, staring out the window at the passing cityscape with uncharacteristic resolve. "This is ridiculous," William muttered more to himself than to her as the taxi crawled through Queens. "That captain was completely out of line. I'm going to write to the board about her conduct." Elaine didn't respond. Her silence was unusual. Normally, she would have murmured some sort of agreement or at least acknowledged his complaints. But something had shifted during that flight. Something fundamental. As the taxi pulled up to their hotel, Elaine finally spoke. "I'm not staying with you tonight." William blinked, certain he had misheard. "What?" "I'm going to Brooklyn to stay with my sister. I'll get my own cab." "Elaine, don't be dramatic. We have the dinner with the Henderson group tomorrow. I need you there." She looked at him, then really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. "No, William. What you need is to recognize what you've become. I have never been more mortified in my entire life. That young man," her voice broke slightly, "he could have been our son's age if we'd ever had children, and you treated him like he was nothing." William stared at her, momentarily speechless. In 23 years of marriage, Elaine had never directly challenged him like this. "Elaine, I've spent 25 years making excuses for you, smoothing things over, apologizing to servers and flight attendants and hotel staff. No more." She opened the taxi door. "My sister's been telling me for years that I deserve better. Today I finally believe her." She stepped out, pulling her suitcase behind her. As she walked away, her fingers unconsciously tapped a forgotten Chopin etude on the handle of her suitcase muscle memory from a life she'd abandoned decades ago. "Don't call me tonight. I won't answer." The cab driver, who had been pretending not to listen, coughed awkwardly. "You still going to the Marriott, sir?" William nodded numbly, watching his wife of 23 years hail another taxi and disappear into the Manhattan traffic. Elaine Barrett sat in the back of her own taxi, hands trembling slightly as she pulled out her phone to call her sister. The weight of her decision was enormous, but so was the relief. For years, she had watched William's behavior grow increasingly entitled and dismissive. She had become an accomplice through her silence, a realization that had crystallized as she watched that young cellist maintain his composure in the face of William's aggression. What William never knew was that Elaine had once harbored dreams of being a concert pianist. She had studied at Juilliard before meeting him, before gradually surrendering her artistic ambitions to support his career. Watching Jamal stand his ground had awakened something long dormant in her, a recognition of her own complicity in William's behavior, and a resolve to reclaim her voice. In the hotel lobby, William's phone buzzed again. It was a text from his CEO, Jonathan Rivera. "Call me now. Urgent." A knot of dread tightened in William's stomach. He stepped out of the check-in line and found a quiet corner of the lobby. "John, what's up?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The voice on the other end was glacial. "Don't John me, Bob. Where are you?" "Just landed from London. In the city now." "Good. Don't bother coming into the office tomorrow or ever again." The words hit William like a physical blow. "What? What are you talking about? Did that captain call you? It's a complete misunderstanding, a total fabrication." "A fabrication, Bob." Jonathan's voice was laced with disbelief. "A fabrication. I'm looking at a video of you clear as day, screaming at a teenager and a flight attendant. A video that was sent to me by Alexander Park of Nexus Capital. Do you know what else Alexander Park sent me, Bob?" William was speechless. His mind raced, trying to place the name. Alexander Park. Then it hit him. The Asian man in seat 1D. He had been filming the whole time. He sent me an official notice that Nexus is pulling out of the Series C financing. Jonathan continued, his voice rising to a furious shout. $60 million. Gone. He called your behavior a symptom of a culture with serious vulnerabilities. He said, and I quote, "If that's who you have negotiating your deals, we can't trust your judgment on anything." The world began to spin around William. The dots connected in a horrifying, catastrophic constellation. But that's not fair. It was a private matter, William stammered. There's nothing private about a public meltdown at 35,000 feet, you idiot. Jonathan roared. The video is already on Twitter. Someone else on the plane must have posted it. It has 100,000 views. The airline's name is trending. Tech Fusion is mentioned in the comments. Our stock is going to get hammered in pre-market trading tomorrow. You haven't just embarrassed yourself, Bob. You've jeopardized this entire company. You are a multi-million-dollar liability. John, please. William begged, his voice cracking. I can fix this. I'll apologize. Apologize? It's too late for that. You're done, Bob. HR will be in touch with your severance package. What's left of it after our lawyers assess the damages to the company. Lose this number. The line went dead. William stood frozen in the hotel lobby, the phone still pressed to his ear. The sounds of the city, the sirens, the horns, the chatter faded into a dull roar. In the space of a 10-minute phone call, his entire life had been dismantled. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His marriage was crumbling. His access to capital and power, the very things that defined him, had vanished. He looked at his reflection in the dark window of the hotel, a flushed, terrified, middle-aged man, utterly and completely alone. He had tried to eject a teenage boy from a first-class cabin because he felt the boy didn't belong. Now, in a stunning reversal of fortune, William Barrett was the one who had been violently and irrevocably ejected from the world he had worked his whole life to occupy. The hard karma had hit back, not like a gentle tap on the shoulder, but like a catastrophic, career-ending collision. As William checked into the hotel, his phone continued to buzz with notifications. The social media storm was gaining momentum. His face captured in Alexander Park's video was already being shared thousands of times, accompanied by hashtags like #firstclassracist and #flyingwhileblack. Meanwhile, in a quiet family-owned hotel in Greenwich Village, Jamal Williams was having a very different evening. His parents, who had flown in the day before to support him, embraced him as he told them about the confrontation on the plane. You handled it with grace, son, his father said, a proud hand on his shoulder. Just like we taught you. His mother's reaction was more visceral. I should have been there. I would have. Mom, Jamal interrupted with a gentle smile. It's okay. Really. In a weird way, I'm almost glad it happened. Not because of what he said, but because of how everyone else responded. The captain, the other passengers, they all stood up for what was right. As the Williams family settled in for dinner, discussing the upcoming competition rather than the in-flight incident, Jamal's phone lit up with a text from his mentor, Dr. Isaiah Thompson. Just landed. Heard rumors about some trouble on your flight. You okay? Jamal texted back. All good. Long story, but a good ending. Focus is on Bach now. Dr. Thompson's reply came immediately. That's my boy. The music is what matters. The rest is just noise. What's the most significant consequence you've ever witnessed for someone's inappropriate behavior? What made that outcome particularly fitting or meaningful? Share your thoughts on how accountability sometimes arrives in unexpected ways. The Bach is more important. They believe appearance equals legitimacy. They've mistaken arrogance for authority. The days that followed the landing of Flight 735 were not merely a continuation of the event, but a series of seismic shockwaves that radiated outwards irrevocably, altering the landscape of every life it touched. For one man, it was a slow, agonizing public execution. For another, a baptism by fire into a world he never expected. For William Barrett, the first 24 hours were a blur of denial and impotent rage. After Jonathan Rivera's brutal phone call, he had stumbled into a soulless hotel bar in Midtown ordering scotches with a trembling hand. He was the victim here, he told himself. A victim of corporate cowardice, of a world gone mad with political correctness. He drafted furious emails on his phone to his CEO, to the airline's board, to his lawyer. Screeds filled with threats of lawsuits and accusations of slander. They went unanswered. His corporate email was deactivated before he could even finish his second drink. His keycard to the executive suite at Tech Fusion's Park Avenue office was now a useless piece of plastic. The true horror began the next morning. A colleague he'd once considered a friend sent him a link with a simple text, "Bob, I'm so sorry." The link was to a viral Twitter moment. The video, shaky but clear, had been given a title by the internet, "Karen of the Skies Gets Grounded by Captain Marvel." He watched his blood turning to ice as his own face, contorted with rage and arrogance, filled the screen. He heard his own voice dripping with condescension. "Did your rapper dad buy this for you?" The words, which had felt so powerful and righteous in the moment, now sounded like the pathetic braying of a small-minded bully. He saw himself shrink and wither under Captain Montero's calm, surgical dismantling of his ego. He wasn't the hero of this story. He wasn't even the villain. He was the cautionary tale. By midday, it was on the national news. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, they all played the clip. Pundits dissected his every word. His photo, a smug corporate headshot from the Tech Fusion website, was plastered next to a still from the video, a stark before and after of a man's reputation being incinerated in real time. His name, William Barrett, was now inextricably linked with public humiliation. Meanwhile, in a quiet practice room at the Juilliard School, Jamal Williams sat alone with his cello. The Bach Suite No. 3 flowed from his fingers with new depth and nuance, each phrase carrying the emotional weight of recent events. The confrontation on the plane had somehow unlocked something in his, playing a richness of interpretation, a maturity beyond his years. The music had always been his sanctuary, but now it felt like something more, a declaration of self in a world that too often tried to define him by appearance alone. Through the practice room's small window, he could see the Manhattan skyline, the towers of Midtown, reaching toward the clouds. Somewhere out there, William Barrett was facing the consequences of his actions. But in this room, with just himself and Bach for company, Jamal found perfect freedom. The notes under his fingers spoke a language that transcended prejudice, a direct line to something universal and true. Tech Fusion Global, in a masterfully swift act of corporate self-preservation, issued a press release that was a work of art in its brutality. It announced Williams' immediate termination, condemned his unacceptable behavior, which contradicts the core values of inclusivity and respect we champion, and in a final twist of the knife announced a $100,000 donation to the Averton Foundation to reaffirm our commitment to supporting emerging talent from all backgrounds. They hadn't just fired him, they had paid to publicly align themselves with his victim. William's personal life crumbled with the same shocking speed. Elaine, who had been a silent partner in his life for over 2 decades, found her voice in his absence. From the safety of her sister's home in Brooklyn, she saw the man she had enabled, and she was disgusted, not only with him, but with herself. The public shame was not the cause of their divorce. It was merely the permission she needed to finally leave a marriage that had been emotionally bankrupt for years. Her lawyer's call was short and devoid of sympathy. The divorce would be uncontested, but she would be seeking a settlement that reflected the catastrophic damage his public misconduct had inflicted upon their shared social standing and assets. He had not only destroyed his own future, he had torched their past. In stark contrast, Jamal Williams found himself in the serene, soundproofed eye of the hurricane. The Averton Foundation, well versed in handling promising young talents, immediately sheltered him. They moved him to a private suite at a discreet hotel, managed all media inquiries, and provided a press liaison. His parents, a history professor and a high school principal from a quiet suburb of London, were concerned but not surprised by what had happened. They had prepared their son for a world that would not always welcome him with open arms. "Are you focused, son?" his father asked, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. "Don't let that man's poison seep into your art. Your cello is your voice. Make sure it's the only one you're listening to right now." His mentor, Dr. Isaiah Thompson, arrived the next day. A man of immense gravitas and kindness, he found Jamal not in a state of agitation, but in one of intense, almost unnerving calm. He was practicing 16 hours a day, the rich, resonant tones of his cello filling the suite. "The world is talking about you, Jamal," Isaiah said gently, sitting across from him. "I know," Jamal replied, not taking his eyes off the sheet music. "They're talking about a video. I am talking about Bach. The Bach is more important." "It is," Isaiah agreed, "but you cannot ignore the pressure. You are no longer just a musician. You've become a symbol." Jamal finally stopped playing. He looked at his mentor, his young face etched with a wisdom far beyond his years. "That man wanted to make me small. He wanted to put me in a box based on what I look like. He failed. Now all these other people, the news, the internet, they want to put me in a different box, the victim who fought back, the symbol of resilience. It's just another box. The only place I am not in a box is when I am playing. When I am on that stage, I am not a symbol. I am just a musician. That is the only place I feel free." And so he poured everything, the humiliation, the anger, the surge of public support, the weight of sudden expectation, into his instrument. The strings of his cello became a conduit for the entire chaotic ordeal, transforming raw, ugly emotion into something transcendent and beautiful, while Jamal transformed his experience into art. William Barrett sat alone in his hotel room, surrounded by empty minibar bottles, watching his life disintegrate in real time on cable news. His phone, once constantly buzzing with messages from people seeking his influence, was silent, save for notices from his attorney and HR department. For decades, he had built his identity around his title, his income, his connections. Now all of that was gone, stripped away in less than 48 hours. In a desperate attempt to salvage something, William reached out to his network of executive friends. Surely someone would understand, would offer support, a consulting gig, something. But the responses, when they came at all, were brief and non-committal. "Let's talk when the dust settles." Taking some time to assess the situation. "Need to consult with my partners." Translation: "You're radioactive and we can't afford to be associated with you." The final blow came when his phone rang with an unknown number. It was his son from his first marriage, a relationship that had been strained for years. "Dad," the voice said, cold and formal. "I saw the video. I just wanted you to know that I'm not surprised. This is who you've always been. I've spent years in therapy dealing with your judgment, your conditional love, your constant criticism. And now the whole world sees what I've always known. Don't contact me or my family again." The line went dead, and with it, the last thread connecting William to his former life. Meanwhile, Captain Gabriela Montero was having a very different kind of debrief. She was summoned to the airline's corporate headquarters in Chicago, expecting at best a grudging acknowledgement that she had handled a difficult situation and at worst a reprimand for her public and personal announcement. She walked into a boardroom with the vice president of marketing and the chief operating officer. Gabriela, the VP of marketing, a sharp woman named Sofia Ramirez, began, "Your handling of the incident with Mr. Barrett was by the book unorthodox." Gabriela prepared her defense. "With all due respect, ma'am, the situation was untenable. My primary duty is to the safety and security of all passengers." Sophia held up a hand, a broad smile spreading across her face. "Unorthodox and absolutely brilliant. Gabriella, do you have any idea what you've done for us? Our social media engagement is up 800%. We've had 3 separate segments on national morning shows praising our zero-tolerance policy on discrimination. The video of your announcement has been viewed across all platforms over 50 million times. You didn't just de-escalate a situation. You created the single greatest piece of positive brand marketing in this company's history, and it was authentic. The COO, Michael Goldstein, nodded in agreement. We have a problem with our premier-tier flyers feeling overly entitled. You corrected one, and in doing so, you sent a message to all of them. You also championed a young man who embodies everything we want our brand to be associated with: excellence, diversity, and grace under pressure. Gabriella was stunned. She wasn't being reprimanded. She was being lauded. Sophia slid a proposal across the table. It was a mock-up of an ad campaign. There was Jamal in a tuxedo cello in hand sitting in seat 2A. The tagline read, "Excellence transcends class." "We're offering Mr. Williams a significant endorsement deal," Sophia explained. "And we're making you the public face of our new pilot recruitment drive. We want more pilots like you, Captain. Pilots with a backbone." In the quiet moments of her hotel room that evening, Gabriella sat by the window watching the Chicago skyline flicker with the last light of day. She thought of her brother Carlos, now healthy and leading the Philadelphia Orchestra, and of Jamal Williams preparing for the performance of his life. She thought about courage, not the dramatic kind celebrated in movies, but the quiet, everyday courage of standing firm when it would be easier to look away. In her 20 years of flying, she had witnessed countless small injustices that passengers of color endured. Today had been different only because she had finally found herself in a position to do something about it. How do you find peace and purpose in the midst of chaos? What anchors you when the world seems to be spinning out of control? Share your personal strategies for maintaining your center when faced with life's storms. Tonight I'm not playing for them. I'm playing for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. The hushed anticipation inside Carnegie Hall was electric. Every seat was filled from the orchestra level to the highest tier of the balcony. What would normally have been a prestigious but relatively quiet affair, the finals of the Averton International Music Competition, had been transformed into a cultural moment. The story of the young black cellist confronted on a transatlantic flight had struck a chord that resonated far beyond the classical music world. It had become a parable about resilience in the face of prejudice about excellence as the ultimate answer to ignorance. The amber glow of the hall's legendary acoustical design cast a golden light across the audience. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The scent of perfume mingled with the polished wood of the century-old venue. From backstage, Jamal could hear the gentle murmur of conversation, the occasional cough, the rustle of programs, a symphony of expectation that would soon give way to the pure voice of his cello. 3 rows from the stage, Captain Gabriela Montero sat in her dress uniform surrounded by her entire flight crew from Flight 735. Maria Gonzalez, the flight attendant who had first intervened, had brought her teenage daughter Sophia, a budding violinist, who now looked at the empty stage with wide-eyed anticipation. "That could be you someday," Maria whispered to her daughter, who squeezed her hand in silent agreement. In the box seats to the right, Alexander Park and his wife were deep in conversation with Jonathan Rivera, Tech Fusion's embattled CEO, who had reached out to Park with a surprising proposal, a technology partnership with the Averton Foundation to digitize and democratize access to classical music education in underserved communities. "Consider it the first step in our cultural reset," Rivera had said. "We're calling it the 2A Initiative." Beatrice Harlow, the elderly woman from the flight, was seated in the center of the front row, her gnarled hands resting on a vintage leather handbag, her eyes bright with anticipation. Rafael Suarez had brought his entire marketing team to witness what he now used as a case study in authentic communication, while Beatrice sat with her daughter and granddaughter, 3 generations united in witnessing musical history. Backstage, Jamal Williams stood alone in the green room. His parents and Dr. Thompson had wished him luck, and then, sensing his need for solitude, had taken their seats in the hall. Jamal could hear the murmur of the crowd through the thick walls, could feel the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. For a moment, doubt crept in. Not about his ability. He had prepared meticulously, had played this piece hundreds of times, but about the context. Would they be listening to his music, or would they be watching a symbol the young man from the viral video? Then he remembered what his grandfather had told him the night before in a transatlantic phone call. They came for the story. Make them stay for the music. Jamal closed his eyes and began his pre-performance ritual. He visualized the piece from beginning to end, felt his fingers moving over the strings, heard the music in his mind with perfect clarity. The cello's rich voice seemed to resonate within him before he'd even drawn the bow across its strings. He took 3 deep breaths, each one slower than the last. Then, unbidden, William Barrett's face flashed in his mind. The sneering dismissal, the assumption of inferiority, the casual cruelty. Jamal's eyes snapped open. For a split second, anger threatened to disrupt his focus. But then, surprisingly, he felt a wave of something like gratitude. William Barrett had given him a gift, though he never intended to. He had reminded Jamal why he played music in the first place, because in a world that often tried to put him in a box, to limit him, to define him by his appearance, music was the one place where he was truly free. "Tonight, I'm not playing for them," he whispered to himself. "I'm playing for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." The stagehand knocked gently on the door. "5 minutes, Mr. Williams." Jamal nodded, picked up his cello, and made his way to the wings of the stage. The 2 other finalists, a brilliant Japanese pianist and a Russian violinist, had already performed. Now it was his turn. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Our final competitor this evening from London, England, performing Johann Sebastian Bach's Cello Suite No. 3 in C major, Jamal Williams." The applause that greeted him as he walked onto the stage was thunderous, far beyond the polite reception typically given to competition finalists. It contained a message: "We see you. We support you. We're here for you." Jamal acknowledged the applause with a simple nod, then took his seat in the center of the stage. The spotlight created a pool of golden light around him, isolating him from the darkened audience. He adjusted his cello between his knees, positioned his bow, and took one final breath. Then he began to play. The prelude started with a cascade of notes, a waterfall of sound that seemed to fill the entire hall. From the very first measure, it was clear that this was not merely a technical exercise. This was a declaration, bold and uncompromising. The resonance of the cello's lower register vibrated through the floorboards, creating a physical connection between performer and audience. Jamal's body swayed gently with the rhythm, his face a study in concentration and joy. The allemande that followed was more contemplative, a flowing dance of question and answer. Jamal's interpretation brought out the movement's searching quality, its philosophical underpinnings. The bow seemed to pull the notes from the air itself, each one perfectly placed, yet feeling spontaneous. It was as if Bach himself was pondering the nature of existence, and Jamal was channeling those questions through his bow. By the time he reached the courante, the audience was completely under his spell. The rapid running passages flew from his fingers with an effortless grace that belied the technical difficulty. His left hand danced across the fingerboard with astonishing precision, while his bow arm created a seamless flow of sound. There was playfulness here, a sense of liberation, as if the music was breaking free from the constraints of form, even as it honored them. In the 4th row, Sofia Gonzalez leaned forward in her seat, watching Jamal's fingers with rapt attention. She had never seen someone so completely at one with their instrument. It wasn't just that he was playing the cello, he was speaking through it, telling a story that transcended language. But it was in the sarabande, the slow, soulful heart of the suite, that the real magic happened. Jamal closed his eyes, and the music that emerged from his cello was so raw, so nakedly emotional, that several audience members were moved to tears. The vibrato on sustained notes quivered with vulnerability, creating moments of such tenderness that the hall seemed to hold its collective breath. It wasn't sad exactly. It was profound, speaking to something essential and universal about the human experience. Captain Montero found herself thinking of her brother's battle with leukemia, of nights spent in hospital rooms where time seemed to stretch into infinity. Somehow, Jamal had captured that exact quality of suspended time in his playing moments, where joy and sorrow were so intertwined they became indistinguishable. The final jig was a dance of pure joy, the kind of uninhibited celebration that transcends cultural boundaries. Jamal's fingers danced across the strings, his bow flying his entire body, engaged in the creation of a moment of shared ecstasy. The tempo was brisk, but never rushed, each note articulated with crystalline clarity despite the speed. As he approached the final phrases, the energy built to an almost unbearable intensity, culminating in a final chord that seemed to hang in the air like a shimmering declaration. When the final note faded into silence, the hall held its breath for a full 5 seconds. It was as if no one wanted to break the spell, to return to the ordinary world after such a transcendent experience. Then, as one, the audience rose to its feet. The applause wasn't just enthusiastic. It was revelatory, a collective recognition that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. It wasn't about the viral video anymore. It wasn't about William Barrett or Flight 735 or racial politics. It was simply about a young man and his cello and the magic they had created together. Jamal stood bowed deeply, and in a gesture that moved many to tears held his cello aloft in a salute to the audience. It wasn't showmanship. It was an acknowledgement that the music belonged to all of them now. As he left the stage, the applause continued, sustained and powerful. In the wings, Dr. Thompson was waiting, his eyes glistening. "That wasn't just Bach," he said, embracing his student. "That was Jamal Williams." The judges' deliberation was the shortest in the competition's history. When they returned to announce the winner, there was a sense of inevitability in the air. The winner of this year's Averton International Music Competition and recipient of the Averton Foundation's Young Artist Award is Jamal Williams. The hall erupted again. Jamal returned to the stage, accepted the crystal trophy, and was handed the microphone. "Thank you," he said simply. "Music has always been my voice. Tonight I felt like you really heard me. I am grateful." Then, in a spontaneous gesture that would be talked about for years, he nodded to the wings, and Dr. Isaiah Thompson joined him on stage with his own cello. Without announcement, they launched into a duet, an improvisational piece that wove themes from the Bach suite with elements of jazz, soul, and even hip-hop. It was a musical conversation between generations, between traditions, between the classical world and the modern one. It was a declaration of freedom. In the audience, Captain Montero found herself weeping openly. Maria Gonzalez's daughter leaned over and whispered, "I'm going to practice harder. I want to play like that someday." Alexander Park turned to Jonathan Rivera and said quietly, "That's why we're doing the 2A initiative, so kids everywhere can feel what we just felt." And in a small generic apartment in New Jersey, William Barrett sat alone watching the live stream on his laptop. The competition had been featured on the evening news, and something had compelled him to find the online broadcast. As Jamal's music filled his empty living room, something shifted in William's chest. It wasn't remorse exactly. He wasn't capable of that level of self-reflection yet. But it was a recognition, however fleeting, that he had been profoundly wrong. A part of him recognized the absurdity of his position, yet he couldn't bring himself to accept responsibility. Still, the evidence before him was undeniable. The young man he had tried to diminish was, in fact, extraordinary. For a brief moment, William Barrett saw not a black teenager in a seat where he didn't belong, but simply a human being of exceptional talent and character. It was a small crack in the armor of prejudice, a tiny fissure in the foundation of arrogance. It wouldn't change his life. It wouldn't restore what he had lost. But it was a beginning. As the final notes of the duet faded away and the audience once again rose to their feet, Jamal and Dr. Thompson bowed to each other, then to the audience. They walked off stage arm in arm, mentor and student elder and youth linked by something more powerful than blood, the universal language of music. What's the most transformative performance you've ever witnessed? How did it change your perspective or touch you emotionally? Share the experience that moved you beyond words in the comments below. Your music isn't just your voice, it's your freedom. And through it, you've opened doors for countless others who will follow in your footsteps. The months following Jamal Williams's triumph at Carnegie Hall transformed his life in ways he could never have anticipated. The young cellist who had once practiced in his parents' modest London flat was now being courted by the world's premier orchestras and record labels. His interpretation of the Bach suites recorded just weeks after the competition became an unexpected crossover hit, introducing classical music to audiences who had never before given it a second thought. But more significant than the fame or the opportunities was the platform Jamal now had to effect meaningful change. With the guidance of his parents and Dr. Thompson, he established the Seat 2A Foundation, dedicated to providing high-quality instruments and instruction to children in underserved communities. The foundation's name, once a painful reminder of prejudice, had been reclaimed as a symbol of opportunity and access. Music saved me, Jamal told a group of wide-eyed students at a Harlem public school during the foundation's inaugural program. Not just from that moment on the plane, but from all the moments before it when the world tried to tell me where I belonged and where I didn't. I'm here to tell you that you belong wherever your talent and hard work can take you. The airline, recognizing both a moral imperative and a marketing opportunity, became the foundation's principal corporate sponsor. Their Excellence Transcends Class campaign featuring Jamal and Captain Montero won numerous advertising awards and drove a measurable increase in customer loyalty. More importantly, it sparked a conversation within the airline industry about accessibility and inclusion. At a charity event in Chicago, 6 months after the Carnegie Hall performance, Jamal reunited with Captain Montero. She was now the airline's Director of Operational Culture, a newly created position that reflected the company's commitment to transforming their corporate values from slogans into practice. "You know," she said to him during a quiet moment away from the cameras, "I broke about 6 company rules with that announcement on the plane, but I'd do it again tomorrow." "You didn't just stand up for me, Captain," Jamal replied, shaking her hand. "You stood up for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. You gave them a voice." Across the country, in countless classrooms, boardrooms, and training sessions, the video of William Barrett's meltdown and Captain Montero's response had become a case study in biased leadership and accountability. Corporate diversity consultants referenced it in workshops. Flight attendant training programs used it to teach conflict de-escalation. Law schools analyzed the potential liability issues. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the classical music world itself. The visibility of Jamal's story had forced a long overdue conversation about accessibility and representation in an art form often perceived as elitist and exclusionary. Conservatories were re-examining their admissions processes. Major symphonies were launching outreach programs in diverse communities. Benefactors were funding scholarships for promising young musicians from underrepresented backgrounds. What happened to you on that plane was a microcosm of what happens in our industry every day. The director of a prestigious music academy told Jamal during an interview, "The assumption that certain people don't belong in certain spaces the burden of constantly having to prove your legitimacy, the expectation of gratitude for being allowed entry. Your response has challenged us all to do better. Alexander Park and Nexus Capital had turned the Tech Fusion incident into a catalyst for industry-wide change. Their new investment criteria now explicitly included assessment of company culture and executive behavior, setting a standard that other venture capital firms quickly adopted. The Park Protocol, as it came to be known, required companies seeking funding to demonstrate genuine commitment to creating inclusive workplaces. The business case is clear, Park explained during a keynote at a major tech conference. Companies that create toxic cultures don't just risk PR disasters. They limit their talent pool, stifle innovation, and ultimately underperform. What we witnessed on that flight wasn't just a moral failure. It was a business liability that no responsible investor could ignore. For William Barrett, there was no redemption arc, no miraculous transformation. There was only a quiet, lonely fade into obscurity. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and first-class cabins now lived in a small generic apartment in New Jersey, his days filled with fruitless job applications and unanswered emails. His severance had been minimal, his savings depleted by legal fees and Elaine's divorce settlement. His name had become toxic in the business world, a shorthand for the kind of executive liability no company could afford. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. His country club membership was revoked. Invitations stopped coming. He was a ghost in the digital machine, his name a permanent cautionary tale, his face a meme representing privileged entitlement. In his lowest moments, William would find himself watching videos of Jamal's performances, searching for something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was understanding of how a teenager had shown more character in 5 minutes than he had demonstrated in 50 years. Or perhaps it was simply the beauty of watching someone exist in perfect harmony with their purpose, something William, for all his material success, had never experienced. It was the ultimate reckoning. His victim had become a symbol of everything he could never be, and his own name was now synonymous with the very prejudice that had led to his spectacular fall from grace. William had lost far more than a first-class seat. He had lost his way. But for Jamal Williams, seated in a recording studio in London, almost exactly 1 year after the fateful flight, that chapter was closed. He was working on his first original composition, a piece that integrated classical structures with influences from his grandfather's jazz background. His cello sang beneath his fingers, the music flowing from some deep, authentic place within him. "There's something different in your playing now," his grandfather observed during a visit to the studio. "Something I've never heard before." Jamal smiled. "I finally understand what you've been telling me all these years. Your music isn't just your voice, it's your freedom. And through it, you can help others find theirs." The old jazz man nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "That's exactly right. And that's why what you're doing with the foundation matters so much. You're not just opening doors for yourself, you're making sure they stay open for all the young musicians who will follow in your footsteps." This story is a powerful reminder that in our connected age, the consequences of our actions can travel faster than any jet. William Barrett's prejudice cost him his career, his marriage, and his reputation. A swift and devastating dose of real-world accountability. But the true lesson lies in Jamal Williams' incredible composure and Captain Gabriela Montero's unwavering moral courage. They proved that the most powerful response to loud, ugly intolerance is not to sink to its level, but to rise above it with undeniable excellence and unwavering conviction. If this story of justice at 35,000 feet resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear a story of hope and consequence. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true stories where character is tested, heroes emerge in the most unexpected places, and the actions we take create ripples that transform lives forever. This is Bliss Whispers, bringing you stories that matter. Remember to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community of viewers who believe in the power of resilience, integrity, and standing up for what's right. Your comments mean the world to us, so let us know what this story meant to you. Until next time, remember that your worth is never determined by someone else's judgment.